Round one.
Welcome to another Mish-Mashing battle round, the 2MK team. We're doing a sound check now. I'm probably not actually audible. If I am, then you know I've been talking all this way because I'm doing a sound check. And we'll deal with it after this. But for now, we're watching pecking, poking, normals. And a relatively difficult matchup, though as it goes, Sakuра's better at it than most people. You gotta learn how to not spend a lot of time trying to open guile up though.
Round two.
So we'll deal with that in a bit. It seems like the sound is fine. So all of my sound check was probably actually on. Today team members will be dealing with secondaries often if they have them. Not everyone has secondaries. Some people got more than their share. And we're looking at one such person now. Specifically, that Kansuki Dynasty plays like 4 characters in this game. Although she tends to play Karine more seriously than any other, they still get a bit of time where she is specifically feeling in the mood to play Ibuki or Kami or even Sakura. And today is a Sakura day. Our lounge is in the usual place. It is, however, somewhat limited in connection compared to usual. We are specifically today restricting it to 4 and 5 bar connections only, mainly because with the way the netcode is now, it tends to report those as better. We first didn't think that was actually what was happening, but it definitely does seem that they look at it differently. The internal game netcode, the server doesn't know anything about those, so if it's inconsistent, then we don't really want to try it. Still, with the latest updates, it does mean that things are a little different in terms of that. You do get matches that are playable but feel a little weird, rather than matches that are stuttery and it could be going really well and then suddenly bad. It's difficult to figure out. But for today, at least from this first match from this side,
Round one.
what you should be expecting is a player who is trying to get used to the idea that they have to move around more before they get to do any footsies related things. And that movement often means that they have to be ready for the opponent to go on offense. Sakura is not necessarily a defensive character, but she has to be played with the general expectation that once you have poked your opponent, they want to get out of the poke, they want to jump, they want to move, they want to dash, they want to hit you. And overlooking that makes life really difficult because you keep on trying to hit on a character who is built primarily on denying other people's options in terms of their hits. You can tell characters like this because they tend to have things like air throws. In fact, this is a strong indicator of this type of character in this game. Aside from like Ibuki, basically all the characters whose game plan revolves around getting to a particular space, reacting to something the opponent does, even if that something is retreating. Sometimes we have people who are totally able to chase down retreats, beat up people, all sorts of things, but those characters almost always have air throws, and it's not actually clear to most players when you start out why, until you have gotten to the point of understanding that air throws, particularly back jump air throw, can counter a lot of ambiguous cross-up style situations, whereas a lot of other buttons don't do this. Plus, even if you mess it up, most of the time you get what we call the dragon roll for reasons that are completely unrelated to anything that you would understand. where your character ends up air resetting, and your opponent then has to suddenly recognize, oh wait, is this the right timing or what? Should I be launching my next attack? Most people at the lower levels will just whiff their next button, and actually most of the time this gives you an opportunity. So you can definitely do some of this regardless of whether or not you have an air throw, but having one really helps because it means that sometimes you grab your opponent and put them in the ground. Still, the focus is often about that, making sure that you understand your character's rhythm, your character's movement and flow. Do you get to keep on hitting buttons, or does waiting for your opponent to try to hit buttons so that you don't, or just to take advantage of the fact that you might want to keep them there? For many characters, you can't just do both of the things. You have to pick one for a short time, convince your opponent you're doing that one, and then do the other one. If you pick randomly, then they will pick randomly, and honestly, you're the one that will end up frustrated in that situation because mostly those characters don't have good responses to those things. If your opponent decides to just EX or just forward heavy punch, depending on the character, you're the one that's going to end up miserable. This can make the game fairly tense, but a lot of us actually learn to play footsies of this type. More so without thinking, it's just an automatic thing. You just play footsies, and you get used to the idea of playing footsies, which is actually why many of the strategies for beating those types of characters involve avoiding footsies for as long as possible to throw the other player off, to remove all of their comfort zones. You have to spend a lot of time actually trying to become more comfortable with the feelings and flows of just not being able to play footsies for long periods because your opponent keeps on doing, for example, what this Ken is doing. Now, Argyle is not really having a lot of problems with it. They understand that their offense is good enough and the opponent's defense is not necessarily good enough at the moment to make them care. But even that, in that moment, you got to see it for a little bit. The Ken player's goal is to stop certain things from happening. Poke at the ground, jump. They're not specifically having a good strategy here unless you had the situation where the Guile is saying, I'm attacking all the time, I want to keep on hitting buttons, and they're picking buttons that might beat the buttons the Guile uses. It's very difficult to do this in the first place. You generally, if you're going to hit buttons that Guile loses to when Guile has not overcommitted yet, you are overcommitting yourself, or at least committing very hard. You gotta be fairly confident that it's time to say uppercut or neutral jump heavy kick or something, because Guile is not a character that lets you get away with these things. It punishes you basically the same way regardless. Confidence in movement also allows players to just ignore you when you do certain things. They don't care enough about your options to pay any attention to the fact that you're using them. That is something that comes up over experience though, just realizing, you know what, yes, I see you there hitting buttons, swinging away, but I don't actually care. Your buttons don't bother me. For example, Argyle here has not bothered to really flash kick this Ken out of the air. This is not specifically because Ken is a poor jumping character. It is because with the current level and style of play showed by our Ken, they aren't really aiming to jump with the usual big Ken setup that leads to, oh, I don't know which side he's on, I don't know what problems I'm about to have. What you're mostly seeing is a Ken who is jumping what looks like to get out of a situation, or to prevent a certain thing from continuing to happen. And at that point, there's not a whole lot that the Guile has to fear. He may get unlucky and be hit, but with a little mindfulness of the fact that this is happening, the problem goes away. Unfortunately, our Ken is not going to stick around to push too hard on improving that right now, it looks like. But we wish them luck with whatever they do choose to do. And we proceed with our lounge. And looks like probably Guile versus Ed, but as noted, our lounge today is character select on. You can come in and show us your secondaries, you can show us other characters that you're good at, you can play them, and if it turns out that, hey, we are a match for your secondary, you can play your main, whatever works for you today. Instead of our normal, we are focused on learning people coming in with their main characters or whatever character they specifically decided to try to go with. Of course, in character select off lounges, you can always take a little time to choose your character beforehand. But that is time. You do risk losing your spot. You do risk other small things. And honestly, it's just a lot of work. But let's look at some Ed versus Guile, because the players chose to go with apparently mains. Let's see what they choose to do. In terms of movement, Ed is, for example, very good at movement, but only if you decide when to go forward with serious dedication to the forward part. Ed is much better at moving backward than he is at moving forward, but when he chooses to move forward, if he's made the right decision timing-wise, he's very effective. For example, that jumping kick, as well as some other little things he does. And we see that the response from the Guile player is actually to shift entirely back to flash kicks for defense, specific spacings that they're using for other purposes, and so on. But you do definitely see little bits of movement within the space between them, the way that the Ed player wants to move, looking for those opportunities where he actually can safely jump against the Guile without getting flash kicked or apparently air thrown, as mentioned before. But there is still at least some timing here where we're seeing the Ed player play more as if they're just trying to stay close enough to make the Guile flinch and make mistakes. And that method might be about staying around. Maybe not, because Guile has super. No, still worked. But from a commentary perspective, let's say, I wouldn't really count on this working repeatedly, because what is more likely to happen is that the Guile player just goes, okay, well, you're in that mode, and unless the Ed player changes, it's fairly easy to take advantage of. But there we see some of it. I'm committing to going forward, but I've chosen a really good time to do so. And again, a really good method and time to do so. That was borderline. I couldn't have told you who was going to win there. You can in fact see a lot of reading and movement going on between these two right now. But and when I say clipped, you'd think, well, how is that a clip? He jumped.
Guile wins.
That is a clip because if Guile had been any slower, I'm fairly sure the flash kick would have missed. These things can happen. In fact, there are a lot of players who spend a lot of time learning how to make uppercuts and flash kicks with, just so that they can get offense on these characters who otherwise have really good air defense.
Round one.
If you put them under enough pressure, they don't recognize necessarily that, oh, you jumped from that space, that my anti-air won't work. Trouble is happening now. But they've already had the physical reaction, they've already hit the relatively easy, in Guile's case, special anti-air, so yeah. Another hard commit forward, ending up being checked by the Guile player. Partially because they probably are, their goal, they're probably used to this. If you play Guile for long enough and have played him seriously instead of just learned specific things that frustrate players, then you know when the opponent is trying to get you to do something on your wake up and you should just wait for them to do the second thing. This is a skill you spend a lot of time learning as Guile or Chun-Li or Juri. when to wait for your opponent to do the first thing and then deal with it after. The same sort of thing comes in at moments like that. And in fact, learning to bait blows is a whole skill unto itself. To not fall into the trap of, okay, I'm close to the opponent, this is a scramble, I should hit a button, against a person or player whose only requirement is to press up and 2 kicks. Sometimes those 2 or 3 kicks are on one button. They're not super stressed about this, like that. One of the upsides of it for the attacker is that Guile can't really do that move twice. You can mash an actual uppercut until it works. With flash kicks and so on, you have one chance, because as soon as you've pressed up and kick, you don't get another chance to do it. You've let your charge go. You can't go back to down back and keep on pressing up for it to work. Which means they actually spend a lot more time learning the timings for this. But now, let's see what will happen. I have no idea. Are they going or not?
It's go time. Let's do this. Alex.
Okay, it appears that we have gotten through all of the little jumbles and are back to a less familiar matchup because of team flow. But familiar enough. This is one of the matches where it makes the most difference and yet is at least meaningfully harder than most. Alex's options mean that both the stand light kick and the crouch heavy punch from Sakura are more difficult to time properly. Not to make use of, you can still use them at the same spots, but your timing has to be better. Similarly, Alex's tendency to keep Sakura at longer ranges means that when she does manage to clip him with like her crouch medium punch or similar, she doesn't normally get to hit another button. Which is hard on you when you have learned to play by hit this button, then this button for pressure or to stop your opponent from doing things. Because you can normally get close enough where this works. Getting to a spacing where this doesn't work can be really frustrating, at least at first. Fortunately, she does still have the good forward medium kick range to work to open Alex up in much the same places that Karine does. Depending on your timings, therefore recognizing that you should hit your own button and then backdash, similar to our Kata series, ends up being helpful in this matchup for Sakura. As well as you've just seen, hitting other buttons. She can actually whiff punish Alex from fairly far out. In fact, it gets harder to fight this matchup the closer she gets. It's also harder to fight this matchup if Alex stops hitting buttons, but you can almost find some way to convince Alex to hit buttons on Sakura. It's harder actually to convince him to hit buttons on Karine because he knows she has to get closer, whereas Sakura has options from that range, many of which are truly annoying enough that you can't just disregard them.
You win.
Alex therefore has the problem of facing a character where he doesn't get to use his own long normals as a pure advantage. They're not trying to get close enough to him for him to stick out buttons as a general option. What does get use, therefore, is his stand and medium and heavy punches.
Round one. Fight.
Flash Chop, of course, does come in quite a lot, but Flash Chop needs you to understand a lot of things about Sakura's movement. But there you see that forward, that standing heavy punch, which has such a good range for keeping Sakura out of where she wants to be because of the pushback part of it. When at close range, his stand medium punch does a better job simply because it's fast enough. It's not the fastest looking move, but it's fast enough to be a problem. Everything else, as you've seen, is really just putting Sakura in her optimal position. And the Sakura player, in this case, just needs to know which of these buttons should I hit now? It's still possible to lose, of course, but the way you lose is never really a question of am I actually being outplayed. As long as Alex keeps on hitting other buttons, it's just a question of how good is your whiff punishing, or in some cases predictability. You do end up having to take certain amounts of damage, simply because Alex has options to always get in if he really needs to, that are difficult for Sakura to counter in time while playing at the correct range otherwise, or at the correct rhythm otherwise. But honestly, a lot of this is just, okay, should I hit a button or not, and which button should I hit? In other words, most characters, Sakura must move in order to maintain this situation. Against Alex players using their standard kit, Sakura doesn't have to move, she just has to wait for Alex to do things, and he'll put himself in those optimal positions for her. Adding her V-trigger onto this just makes it even more frustrating because her V-trigger is plus and mid-range long and deals with a ton of things Alex wants to do, so you don't really get much out of it.
You lose.
Fortunately for Alex, Sakura doesn't really build up a lot of V-meter in this matchup that quickly. She mostly builds it up when she gets hit. So he can use his time, he can bide his time to get a massive damage advantage, get a big life lead so she can't afford to trade or take certain risks. But without the meter for that, she's not really someone you can just walk up to. What's going to make the difference here, therefore, is the amount of understanding that Kansuki Dynasty has of when to stop hitting buttons and how to deal with scrambles. Scrambles are an important part of most of Sakura's matches. If you have a good sense for what just happened, as in you're constantly the sort of person who is watching the scenario and knowing what just happened, even though you were probably focused on something else at the time, you end up with a much better concept of whether or not it's time for you to hit a button or if your opponent has the advantage at the moment at close range. And since most people who play this game, but build up those same types of skills, have a perception of how to do things, Sakura does get to break this by basically saying, okay, I'm going to eat Sakura cut now. And she creates so many scrambles that it's difficult to create a bait situation. Normally, to bait someone, you frustrate them, put them in a position where, okay, now we finally got to the point where I have the option to keep on pressuring. But I think, because I've frustrated you so much, you want to uppercut or something out of my move. So I'm not going to do anything. I'm already winning, probably. Even if not necessarily by health, I'm winning psychologically in some way. And with that realization, you just go, no, I'm gonna let you get away. Because if you don't uppercut,
Final round.
escaping is fine. You can work in some really well-timed fuzzy guard style shimmies if you're good at it. But from the other side, you can see what happens when, for example, that was 4 buttons. And overall, the more buttons Sakura hits, the more effective Alex is going to be without really doing anything. She gets more control of the match, technically by doing less things. But you can't get into the mindset of, I'm not going to do anything. It is specifically the mindset of, I have done a thing, but now it's time to stop.
You lose.
It's a skill that one builds up over time from the scramble side, without necessarily doing anything. But from the actual perception of other people's flow, obviously you have to fight other people. You can therefore practice scrambles against bots if you really want to. You just go directly to... what's the best one? Because they're all relatively good at it, but Mika's probably the best, Laura's good. Just depends on whoever you find your character ends up close to without you knowing what exactly follows you being close. And practice your scrambles from there. As long as the situation is not somehow consistent, then you're probably fine. If you don't know any of that, I'd say your best option is Bison, simply because even if you didn't manage to input Bison Bot at a really high level that it's super good at what it does, Bison as a character creates a certain type of scramble that, as long as you manage to get him to do like his moves as a generality, you're probably fine. The Alex mirror is always hard on DeWolf because he's so used to using his character's movement options and superior button range that when faced with an opponent who has the exact same button range and the exact same movement options, there's a lot more planning that has to be done and a lot more understanding of the flow of the character. He has definitely been improving when it comes to when to backdash, when to use longer moves, when to flash chop. And I expect that those things are going to help out a lot here. But in order to really get through this, it's been heavily implied that you should just use more V-reversals. Alex is a relatively easy character to V-reversal. And the mirror match is not a place where most Alex players are thinking about the fact that they are going to get V-reversal. But since it also doesn't really help that much in terms of winning the match with the V-trigger, V-reversaling at the right time can prevent you from having to play the part of the match where the other Alex player has the highest advantage. Alex versus Alex is functionally a 10-0 matchup when one person is plus. Whoever is plus is just winning. And your V-reversal is basically the easiest way to make sure that, yeah, you were plus, but now you're not.
Alex wins.
Especially since you don't really have the option to overuse it, nor do you really need to. You eventually find a spot where you think, okay, I have defended a little bit, I want out of this. If you can control your emotions enough to not V-reversal out of stress or fail to V-reversal out of stress, then your opponent shouldn't be able to generally predict it entirely. And while Alex is definitely a character who can put on the pressure and then grab you even if you try to V-reversal him, he only gets to do this with like 1 or 2 hits. In other words, he does have the ability to just keep being plus for a long period, but after the second hit or so, he's no longer in a position to bait a V-reversal very easily. And most people who are hitting 2 buttons in a row are not thinking about baiting a reversal on the second button. He's just not overall a character built for this. And if you saw him hit a button that likely is a V-reversal bait, you probably can just keep blocking because he's probably not very plus either. Worse yet, as just demonstrated, all his better V-reversal baits have to be executed in such a way that will cause him to often whiff a full command grab, which means he can just do nothing. So what's the deal? Make sure your opponent is plus as little as possible and just V-reversal them off the rest. I feel like that was like... But as you can guess, if a player owns and plays a character, they probably have that character's bot and can react to nearly all the things, not only because they play him, because not everyone can actually do that. There are a lot of players that cannot stop their own mix-ups because the mindsets required for doing the mix-up and the mindset required for defending it are completely different.
Alex wins.
But mindsets are one of the things that holds one at silver for the longest. In fact, it's partially the reason why we have these lounges in the first place. Even if you barely have any other time to play, you've got to put in the work at least sometime to try to better your mindsets. So sometimes you get beaten up a little bit at the beginning of the week in order to end up being able to think about it. You're straight off of a weekend, probably. Yes, it's a Monday of work if you work on Mondays, but you're not hating your life or your job yet, probably. Well, this is going to take a little longer because, once again, mentioning character select is on. However, our lounge is also full, so if you are watching, expect to have to remain watching, more so than joining us. Alex versus Seth is... I want to call this an easy Alex matchup. Not because Seth is weak to Alex, but because Alex has no weaknesses to Seth. Alex basically doesn't care about anything Seth does. At all. Ever. If using V-Skill 1, technically this is also one of the characters who gives Seth the least on the absorb. So it doesn't even matter. Alex has the range to keep up with and at least, not if not punish, at least make Seth have to care about half the things he does. Which is why you actually are seeing this style of play. Because being tick thrown, Seth does not have the greatest tick throw. It's not like top tier compared to some characters. What makes a good tick throw is the number of other things the character could reasonably do in the same space. And Seth is not super high on that. But you're still not seeing Seth specific things, therefore. You're not seeing a lot of, okay, well, here's some cool Seth things that he's doing that make Alex miserable. No, it's just Seth poking because Seth pokes. But Alex's range means that even though all of these are not the best options in terms of damage, Seth doesn't get to do a whole lot. That's probably his biggest opportunity right there, when they have actually gotten so far apart that Alex trying to continue his pressure leads to a weird whiff punish similar to the Sakura problem. Seth is definitely in that character style, even though he doesn't really have an air throw. As I mentioned when he came out, he's basically just one button Chun-Li, so you technically have all of the same solutions to problems. But they're all weaker.
Seth wins.
However, we know that this player is actually a Zeku, and that means they spend a lot of time, probably a massive amount of time, thinking about how to make other people's lives difficult, in terms of spacing and build-up and similar. This is a completely valid and relatively easy way to do this matchup, therefore, for Alex. The question is what to do with the V-reversal, well, with the V-meter once he's got it. V-reversals don't always cause any help because Seth doesn't use a lot of really heavy normals to do what he's doing. But at the same time, there's not a whole lot about the V-trigger that makes this any easier or more helpful. It does, however, serve a very strange purpose. It prevents Seth from being able to play that form of the game at all for a short period. If you are basically losing because Seth is doing this and just hitting more and more buttons and close to you and you don't know when to stop him, as Alex, if you have enough V-meter and you can therefore parry, Seth is not that heavy a mix-up character when it comes to those things, and Alex's parry doesn't have to be figured out, you just parry. Seth also tends to be the character that puts himself in a lot of positions where if he goes for a move afterwards, he doesn't have anything that really gets him out of the situation. In fact, I'm fairly sure that if you parry Mad Cradle on the first two hits, the rest of the hits just entirely whiff, meaning that Alex getting his chance to build up meter when he realizes, oh, I'm chasing you now, you have a we're even in life, or you barely have a life lead, I should build up my meter so that I don't have to worry about this too much.
You can't escape.
For example, this is a perfect situation. Activate V-trigger now, and most of what Seth can do doesn't actually amount to much. Unfortunately, without the life lead, you can't just win by timeout. And there's the life lead now, so you now can win by timeout. And yes, Alex's V-trigger will take so long to wear off that it just becomes possible. Not long enough that you actually would be like, oh, I have infinite time, but it's definitely enough to put a chunk in it to make the Seth player more desperate or similar. And since Seth does not and generally cannot build up V-meter on Alex in this V skill from far away, but we're seeing all that Zeku style flow of stuff like whiff punishing by grabbing people's legs. So there's still a lot of options here for I am moving and you can't do anything about it. While this is not a whiff punish heavy matchup for most people, for Alex it can become so, because he doesn't have a lot of strengths to go with this flow, even though he doesn't have a lot of weaknesses either. It's why we're seeing so much of this match played from relatively far away and with longer moments between them. And the only use of that for probably the entire set. But 617 Destroyer on point. It's always interesting to see what happens when someone brings the skills and mindset from their main to a secondary that suits them. Even when the characters themselves are quite different, you can still often see little bits of things they've learned or understanding of their flows to help you know why they play the way they do.
Let's do this.
It's why some people are so quick to judge somewhat harshly, but not necessarily incorrectly, that a secondary does not suit you. When you say, well, I'm picking up this character because they seem strong. No, you're picking up that character because you think they can get away with things that your main can't get away with. Which may work for a time when other people are unfamiliar, but it almost always turns out to be wrong. That said, sometimes you can pick up all new skills from this. And we are avoiding the Seth mirror by seeing Seth versus Falk. This is another match that's a little complicated. Seth has options against Falk, but they're mostly from the air. And Falk normally has more options in the air, is somewhat limited because Seth can do that air/kick thing. She can obviously anti-air it, but that. Our Falk bot is basically this, honestly. Because she's not a character with a whole lot of ways to be played when it comes to neutral. So we spent a lot of time working on that. We put in like 2, I think, of her actual pressure string style things, and of course, at least did our best to make sure that when it came to, can this character confirm into big damage and make you miserable? The answer was yes. So, you know, if you've ever tried our Falk bot, even without a particularly good input, as long as you got the last input, I think number 5 correct, you will have to deal with most of this. She is not super threatening, but if you can not figure out how to get to her, then obviously stress ensues. So a lot of it is built around teaching you how do you get at this character. Recent changes have made her even better at this staying out of the way thing, so fortunately the bot just more or less picked up all of that because they were mostly frame data changes. And usually when those are the changes, unless the input was really, really tight, or some recovery amount was changed, it's usually not going to matter. That, for example, might have been a moment to think, oh, I could have gotten you that one. But there's that crouch light punch. Her stand and crouch light punches are now basically among her stronger tools. And since she doesn't care that much about being walked to the corner, especially by Seth, I wouldn't even say even by Seth, this is not a super surprising outcome here.
Falk wins.
That was a gentle but cruel thing to say. Anyway.
Round 1. Fight.
Seth's best bet in this situation is exactly what you're seeing the president do now. Just walk. Just walk. You don't really have to do anything else in the first place because Falk doesn't have any real options against Seth just walking. Seth has too many reactions that could be had against anything Falk wanted to do other than walk backward. Now, this of course can be kind of boring, but overall, it's probably your best option. This is why sometimes when we say that you shouldn't really try to fight Falk as a character anymore, it's this sort of thing we mean. You don't have to just stand there, you don't have to do nothing whatsoever. But if you are on offense and you have the options to be pushing on your opponent to get the space, don't necessarily try to hit them. Falk needs to walk backward, whereas you just need to be aware if she tries to attack you somehow. Nearly everything she does will be entirely reactable. Especially if you've learned to like check dashes, then she really doesn't have much she can do. And as we know, the president is good at both dash checking and anti-airs, so this is basically going to come down to, does Seth feel the need to try to hit Falk after positioning correctly? because this is the only opening Falk is going to get to jump or do pretty much anything. That, for example, was probably anti-airable. That is how that's going to go nearly every time. That didn't turn into much. And honestly, given false options, couldn't have. If you get stressed over failing your anti-airs, it'll be a problem. But even then. Seth also has a good zoning jump, which can be anti-aired by Falk, but like most long zoning jumps, there's an option to simply not hit the button and cause the character to whiff. And we've specifically mentioned and specifically trained with bots. I'm not sure the character trains with bots still, but the idea being that if you learn to safe jump against Falk, where safe jump in this case is just making her miss or jumping to a range where she shouldn't be able to anti-air you anyway. A lot of the time, Falk's anti-air options take so long to recover that you get to hit her for free. But now we have a different president. I think we've seen this person before. I feel like we've seen this person before. Either way, G versus Falk is similar. G just walks, mostly. He may also be able to do some other things and take mild damage if he wants to risk powering up or going for G burst at particular timings and really long spacings. As long as he has one level of presidentiality, honestly, this works fairly well. And Falk is not known for her massive knockdown potential against this character, so building up presidentiality isn't really super hard. If anything, the challenge to building it up would be not getting hit while you're doing it and interrupted. But will it even be Falk versus G, or will we see Seth again? Or even Zeku? Ed. Well then, since none of that mattered, but we have already looked at an Ed for this time, we're back to committing really hard to advancing. Both of these characters have the tendency to hit a couple buttons, put themselves at a perfect spacing, and jump over your head. And both of these characters are really technically quite bad at stopping the others jump over the head part. Meaning that they are similar to Kage situations. You really should jump over, you sure you should dash under or jump yourself. In most levels of play, Ed is disadvantaged here, because Ed is, by most standards, a lower tier character. He has slightly less options, and the things he's good at don't necessarily lead to damage or winning so much as they lead to not losing. I would feel as if Ed is technically a stronger character when the game is 60 seconds.
Round 2.
But that does not necessarily mean much because he's not necessarily as good at getting life leads. He is, however, fairly good at stressing people out so that if they try to get in on him and fail, he might get some big damage conversions. Still, even with that, you've got some difficult execution and some high awareness required to balance out the fact that almost all his other execution is easy. When I say Ed has difficult execution, I'm referring almost specifically to Psycho Flicker, which is a pianoed punch input that must be done correctly in a very short space of time if you want to use it for certain purposes. Ed is that character for those people who say, execution is hard, I'd be good at fighting games if I only had to do spacing things. And a lot of the time, I'm not knocking those people at all, because a lot of the time they will prove you right, or rather prove themselves right. They actually are just good at fighting games if they don't have to do a 6-2-3 motion every time they want to get out of a situation. However, what they do need to be good at, which might not be as obvious to all of them, is some really specific spacing and timing things. So if your thought was, I am good at this game except for
Round 1.
the actual hitting of the buttons, and you play Ed, you're probably going to find out really hard one way whether or not that is true or very untrue. Either you have the timing to do it, and having your moves reduced to, in many cases, one button, depending on how you set your buttons. The answer is yes, you are. He's also a good character to practice that sort of thing on, because you don't really have to learn execution for Ed. You can just learn timings and spacings for things, right? Here we go.
Round 2. Fight.
So, are we going to... No, there we go. Of course, the problem with the character select on lounge is that you're both able to do that, so you don't actually know, you can't really counterpick the opponent as easily, or even if you're not specifically aiming to counterpick them, if you're thinking, oh, I would like to play character A and have the option to do so because my opponent is playing character B, it kind of sucks when you turn out to be wrong about that. Absorb. That was some determination. I would not have expected anyone to try that.
Final round. Fight.
But there you get to see what we're talking about. If you are committed enough to understanding that sort of spacing and timing, Ed can be a satisfying character even if he isn't really the best option for the job, by most standards. Technically, one of the things that makes Ed less effective at high level is simply that other people make less mistakes. And Ed doesn't have a way to force mistakes very often. But, for example, if this was in fact a 60-second, then Ed just won. So, it still comes up sometimes, that feeling that, you know, this character is not quite suited to this format of game, but you could test his effectiveness in shorter rounds as an example to see what would happen. And maybe even learn something from playing him under those conditions enough to figure it out. Like, what should you do? This is a good example now, maybe. For example, had that been a conversion off the counter hit, then, yeah, win.
Ken wins.
So, since our platinum player, we have no idea what character they're going to play, this is going to get interesting in a minute. There we go.
Let's do this.
We are about halfway through our usual stream time. Not necessarily lounge time. Lounge sometimes goes up to 3 hours, really. But they have switched to Ryu, making this a little bit easier. But we'll see. Necalli obviously has the tools to deal with Ryu, and every character by definition of the design of the game as said by Capcom should have the tools to deal with Ryu. That does not mean it becomes a question of player skill per se, because Ryu players tend to have a lot of experience with getting around the tools designed to stop them. And as his combos have gotten better and better lately, mostly I would say what you need to play Ryu well now is a good sense of when to convert into damage. And sometimes a good sense of when to jump. Take throws help, but I've seen players play Ryu at high level without take throws. They just keep pressure up and white health you into nothingness. Cosmolf does have the general flow for how to do this though, and as you train more and more every week, it improves more and more. This is because Necalli is exactly like Ryu in that way. Most players don't know what Necalli is trying to do. Most players can't tell you, this is Necalli's game plan, make sure he doesn't do this, make sure he doesn't aim to do this. You can't tell. Necalli does what Necalli feels like. Or what counters what you're going to do because he already saw it or sensed it or whatever. This often means that the easier way to deal with Necalli is to be more aggressive, but that also means that the better the Necalli player's defense is, or the better their sense of when you're going to move or how, the less effective you are. It's another down to the same type of thing. Necalli doesn't really wait for other people to make full mistakes. Necalli does what Necalli wants, and if you happen to make a mistake in your judgment, then you die.
Necalli wins.
So, we're either going to see a more aggressive Ryu play, assuming this match even continues, because there maybe have been... No, it wasn't really that.
Fight.
We're either going to see more aggressive Ryu play, which is possibly what's happening here. Or more of the same really, but not so much from the perspective of Necalli being just as effective. No, because Ryu can be more effective by doing less things. Still, that moment of, okay, I'm going to do this because my opponent's character wants to achieve X, doesn't really exist against Necalli for most people, making it difficult to deal with Cosmic Wolf in the way that most of us are used to playing fighting games. He makes him a good opponent for a lot of situations, but it does help a lot the other way.
Round 2. Fight.
Definitely more aggression now. But even this isn't necessarily enough. It has a lot more to do with when Necalli jumps in this case. And how ready the opponent is for those jumps. Fortunately, since this opponent is Platinum, we can generally expect that It's not as if, hey, I'm going to jump more to counter your aggression. It's going to just be a band-aid that solves it.
Final round. Fight.
Meaning that Cosmic Wolf will get his full practice. Specifically, he now needs to jump, at least a bit, but is less likely to get away with doing it at the wrong times. Which is quite strongly his preference. He likes to be challenged by being taught not to do something whenever he does it wrong. Ooh, used to get a corner, but did not have enough momentum to keep it going. And it was that moment of baiting that probably changed the rest of the match. Because if one was expecting full-on aggression the whole time, that's how they get you.
Round one. Fight.
Still, now we are back to where we started. Movement. Different players trying to understand what the other is trying to do in very specific spacings. But there's the counter, just stand heavy punch. If you played Ryu for a while, you actually know very well that you can just stand heavy punch a lot of jumps. Oh, max range. But not quite, combo dropped. As we mentioned, the team is mostly... A lot of our research required different people at different levels of play. It required a lot of time spent not specifically leveling up in rank, but in understanding of different things, which honestly doesn't help that much in ranked. If we've ever given you the impression that just the bot training itself will get you out of bronze or whatever, sorry, because you have to change the way you think in order to beat the varying numbers of opponents. Or you get lucky on some Saturday and happen to get out, and then don't ever fall back. But there's a heavy amount of mindset work involved in this. And you have to understand how to apply bot to mindset in order to get what you need. But Cosmic Wolf has been doing a lot of that mindset work and a little bit of bot work because he did a fair amount of bot work before. This, however, is one of those places where, regardless of anything else, obviously, one will shine. Ryubot is one of the first bots you spend any time with, and even without doing so, a basic understanding of your own flow will normally get you through Ryu matches against people who are not doing a very specific thing. That very specific thing being the thing that the bot is meant to teach you to stop. This player is not doing that thing, and therefore, you get to see Cosmic Wolf going all out in terms of intent and ability of all types to see the opponent's movement, understand their intent, and take advantage of it in a very short space of time. However, this is probably going to get iffy because the opponent does have V-Trigger... Oh, that's V-Trigger 2. Never mind. If it was V-Trigger 1, it would actually have been more difficult, because now Ryu would be able to hold out for a longer time without having to worry about Nikali's movement speed. But now, the disc guidance, and no full punish, which is probably a good judgment, as it is possible for Nikali to make that harder, especially when his V-Trigger is already active. But the battle of attrition ends with the victory of It's a Wrap, so it's a wrap, I guess. There is also an Akali player for whom that win quote probably made sense. There's nothing to feel. They're so indigenous that you can't tell. And they're heading out, leaving our lounge back at just the usual suspects once again. However, as mentioned, those of us who have secondaries or who are experimenting with characters are likely to do so, meaning that we will still have a bit to talk about today.
Shadow base at night. Sakura. Alex.
So we're back to the discussion of how this works out for Alex. He can easily get back into something closer to his standard flow by hitting various forms of heavy punch and medium punch, mostly standing. But this of course makes him susceptible to Sakura's crouching medium kick. Fortunately, at the range that Alex stands at, even if she wants to convert into Hadouken, it's not really that helpful, meaning he doesn't have to worry a lot about taking a lot of damage from doing this, whereas he's also really good at converting into bigger damage when his button happens to hit.
Okay, let's rumble.
Round one.
This is a pushback game, realizing when he has the correct options, when his pushback has created a situation that benefits him, and in some cases planning the whole thing, specifically hitting a button knowing that your opponent will block it, purely so that they end up where you want them to. Not all of us think about this very much. And for a while it doesn't tend to be necessary. You need it mostly to beat gold players. Because most players who are not able to get out of silver are the type who tend to act as soon as they are able without spending a lot of time thinking about where they are on the screen. This means that one of the things we mention often when talking about Guilty Gear, basically, does this character happen to win at this range and this rhythm, ends up being the deciding factor. In Street Fighter this is less effective as a deciding factor because there are a lot more things where neither player really comes out a winner, and conversions from those sorts of situations don't often lead to huge damage in the first place, so you don't have to worry too much about it. But when it does happen, and there are a few characters that can absolutely just convert off nearly any stray hit and kill you, that's why fighting those characters is often so difficult before you have this skill. Players with those characters tend to float up to gold simply by overwhelming the opponents with damage, even though they're generally playing neutral at about the same level. Of course they then get stuck there for reasons that are not really the purview of this stream, but you still can't get past them. Even if you learn particular other skills to get yourself up to gold, you're still going back to face the same people doing the same things, except with a little extra experience from trying to fight all those people who do other things. In short, eventually you pick up this skill, because without it, it's really difficult to do anything. Some characters, of course, depend on this far more than others. But of the ones that don't rely on it too much,
You lose.
it's usually either because they have way more range than anyone else, or because they retreat after certain attacks. Meaning that it doesn't come up in the way you'd expect. You don't end up playing footsies with those people and figuring out the exact button to hit because they're going to hit this one. You end up watching them try to get away from you before the situation
Round
can
one.
come up.
Fight!
Meaning that, at times like this, you're still gonna end up needing the practice.
Looks like you could use more training.
Round two. Fight!
This therefore becomes a large test of Kansuki Dynasty's control. Learning when to crouch block, when to use crouch medium punch, when she's not close enough to do X thing or Y thing, and when to not hit buttons to get out of the situation in general.
You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
So we are back to the aforementioned Alex v Seth. Alex's advantages come mostly from finding the right moment to get more V-meter, which Seth doesn't challenge as easily as most other characters, and then activating that V-meter to prevent all of the close range stuff that Seth wants to do from actually happening. It does help to have a parry against jump-ins as well, because while it does not disable all of the trickiness Seth can do from a zoning style level jump, it does make it enough that Seth tends to telegraph the jump a little more, meaning, given the range and the invincibility of a certain thing, that Alex just gets to use air knee smash to deal with it instead. Of course, this is going to be the bane of DeWolf's existence, given that executing that move is not exactly something we have on his sheet as complete. The President, therefore, is countering a lot of this by using more forward motion from Seth that doesn't involve pressing the buttons, because that's actually one of the easiest ways for Alex to end up with a lot of V-meter, managing to get out of the spacing expected and activate the V skill at a timing where the Seth player is hitting forward punch or something. The punch whiffs, neither one gets really much out of it, but Alex wasn't going to punish Seth for big damage anyway. It's very important actually for Alex to get that active even if he has to activate it in neutral, similar to how he charges it up, primarily because never forget that Seth has one of the higher conversions of damage in the game. If they're really into it, even with Alex's health, you can find yourself rapidly losing, and he doesn't need to use a lot of meter, if any, in this matchup to keep up normal play, so you don't really get to do anything. Unless you can convince the Seth player that they must uppercut out of things, you're not going to see much use of Seth's meter, meaning you're constantly at risk of CA or any of the longer conversions that Seth becomes aware capable of once the meter is used. In short, Seth is not really a character that uses meter for pressure, more so a character that uses meter for conversions and for big damage. Meaning that if you don't give him the opportunity, he's not going to randomly use it, waste it, and then give you an option to defend your way out of the use of the meter. You're only going to see that meter used when you have been hit.
Round one. Fight!
In some ways it may in fact be better to start this match by not taking the life lead from Seth. As long as you don't take too much damage, and you stay close to Seth's value, or in this case, one of the better options is to stay in this state where it's functionally not this, you can't tell who has the life lead. Because for many Seth players, this is more likely to mean that they're going to stay away. They're not going to try to challenge Alex, knowing that he's not specifically weak to any of their tools. And that increases the chances that he will be able to safely raise his V meter without ending up in this situation, because at this point, even activating it now is not going to help a lot. You'd have to play it nearly perfectly to make proper use of the V trigger for defense at that point.
Round two. Fight!
This may come as a shock to people who have played Street Fighter 4 a lot, because in that game technically Seth had Sonic Boom and therefore you had to care. Now you don't have to care anymore. Seth can sort of reach you quickly, usually more so when using the skill 2. Probably the better option in this matchup, honestly. Many characters where Seth is able to whiff punish by getting in quickly, but doesn't get much out of what is absorbed, or doesn't really get much absorb opportunities, it's easier to just pick V skill 2 and proceed with your life. Since most of Seth's combos don't actually convert all that well into the V skill 1 for the absorption in the first place, if you're playing too much footsies, you generally either won't be able to do it, or it won't be a good idea to do it for other reasons. This, for example, is basically almost perfect situation. Like that.
Alex wins.
They have the option
Let's do this.
to play this as Nakali Mirror. But I don't remember what our last discussion on the matter is, and it's usually better to do it the other way. But it also doesn't specifically matter. After all, it's a team. They can play each other whenever they want. Often we end up playing like this in the latter part of stream, but this is usually after getting something to think about from facing someone else who happened to stop by at the beginning. And that sort of thing is often helpful.
Okay, let's rumble.
Round one. Fight!
A lot of this matchup, what we mentioned on the stream a long time ago, was getting Alex to hit a button so that Nikali could dash in and just do like light command grab or something. But it's not easy to make Alex hit buttons, nor is it easy to do light command grab. Compounding both of these with the fact that if you telegraph this wish of yours too much, then the opposing player's mind is constantly on it, meaning that they're more likely to evade it or think about how to evade it. This gets better for Nikali once he is in V-Trigger because that dash though, but if you want to play seriously, you have to learn to do it without getting into V-Trigger first, especially since Alice is not the easiest to pin down with the Seismo. Meaning this is one of those matches where Nikali has to play a little more footsies. The stand medium kept doing a good job for the most part, but it's not necessarily enough in and of itself. Especially since most of the defense against Alex that Nikali can put up is either baitable or involves a backdash. And the backdash tends to put Nikali into a position he doesn't want to be in, both as a scramble and because it makes his next move more predictable. He doesn't have anything that really reaches from there. He'd have to stomp and hope the opponent dashed forward, which Alex doesn't really need to do. Go for Seismo and hope they don't jump. And I think you could practically jump on reaction, even if you didn't actually end up landing the kick. Alex also has enough range that a lot of the time he'll land the kick. So the key is, how do I not have to backdash for as long as possible? Very difficult to actually keep going. One good option, therefore, is actually to stand closer rather than further away. Nikali can do a lot of this match by just walking forward. Alex is not a character that can absolutely keep him out, and Nikali has a fairly good set of whiff punishes for a lot of situations, as well as moves that can be used to get advantages at close ranges when he chooses not to do that.
Round two.
One option you don't see very often but is also effective, for example, is walk forward into close range Seismo, because the opponent is generally not going to jump. They're too busy thinking about what button you're going to hit and what you should do about it. So adding that extra option to your flow means that they have even more to think about, and stressing out defensive-ish characters like Alex is something Nikali excels at and benefits from a lot. But, of course, as noted before, Cosmo tends to learn by attempting the risky or incorrect thing.
Alex wins.
That player that you've met that deals with situations by making you prove that you can counter them, he's that player. Meaning that if you want to win, you have to be able to convince Cosmic Wolf that you're not going to react to something and then do it. Or just be ready immediately after getting hit by something the first time. Nakali is a character with somewhat layered offense, but that does not mean that it's going to be a matter of we're now using this layered offense. Because if you try to get there, it often changes your instincts, unless you are the sort of person who tends to develop said offense by instinct. If you were playing the game instinctively before, there's no specific reason to go into a lot of thinking and development of strategic offense layers after. People do have different styles of play, and they can, despite many claims to the contrary at the beginning of this game, be used in the same characters. This matchup is one that we see fairly often though, and therefore don't necessarily have a whole lot to say about it. But both these players have been working on different aspects of the match that put pressure on the other. So I guess we're about to see, assuming they can keep their focus, if this is the first fight of the lounge after all. But assuming they can, we're probably going to see the outcomes of both of those levels of training.
Like you could use more training.
Round 2. Fight. Alex wins. Round 1. Fight. Round 2. Fight. Final round. Fight! Akuma wins. Round one. Fight!
Looks like you could use more training.
Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Alex wins. It's go time.
And another quick rotation. Bringing us around to a matchup that requires a lot more awareness on both sides. Assuming that both players play who they're playing normally, but I don't see any reason why they don't. You have the issue of Sakura being able to charge her projectile enough to knock Nikali out of this guidance. And mostly, Nikali can't do anything about this. Meaning that he has to play the fireball game in a way he normally doesn't. He has to go over them, he has to neutral jump, he has to forward jump, dive kick. The standard tool for the matchup isn't the best. However, enough awareness leads to being able to hit Sakura with the Seismo instead. That said, Nikali does not completely perfectly control the range of that move, and there are spaces on the screen, some that are even not necessarily the furthest possible, where you can stand and not be hit by this move. Understanding that exact range is difficult, but more importantly, it creates a spacing where Nikali must move forward or backward first before hitting the button. And otherwise, this is relatively equal damage between them, with an advantage going to Nikali in that he gets the damage and gets to build up his own B meter by doing so. Sakura faces a different problem. After all, if he does just block those projectiles, what is she even getting out of it? In fact, she's spending a lot of time fighting in ranges like that one for no clear benefit. Meaning that a lot of this match, in terms of understanding the projectile game for Sakura, has to do with understanding when Nikali is least likely to respond correctly to a fireball. Which brings us back to where we started, basically. Understanding movement and the rhythm of the match itself.
Round 2. Fight.
Similarly, there are a lot of times where Sakura needs to slightly limit her own movement. Things and timings between moves need to be intentional and deliberate instead of, okay, this move is done, time to do the next move. Because the rhythm, in that case, goes to Nikali's advantage without her being able to do too much about it. Even moving after doing certain things has this problem, as Nikali will just do things because he has options to beat nearly all her options if she just does something else immediately. This is also one of the few matchups where using the V trigger specifically for the purpose of being able to throw more powerful fireballs is actually a highly recommended thing. Normally, we recommend that if you're going to use this V trigger on Sakura, use it for footsies. It stops a lot of characters' options if they don't have a good way in. It forces them to think about when to jump at spacings where Sakura can easily anti-air, and it lets her play a ground game that is relatively oppressive, especially if she has at least one bar of regular CA gauge to back it up. Of course, you don't want to just overdo the fireballs either. that is a good timing. Specifically, giving the opponent the impression that you're going to retreat and that they should take their time, and then using it to charge up your fireball instead. If you can do this with the correct flow, your opponent will be more likely, in Mikali's case, to do something like that, to stay still, meaning that you've given them the impression that you are going to stop. And generally, at least at this level, it means you have more freedom. They're less likely to respond to certain things, they're less likely to block your overhead, deal with your dash up light kick. All of those things become options, more so because your opponent is thinking, okay, I'll just wait for her to throw the fireball and mess up. This skill comes up in a lot of matchups. When you have a move that is built to make your opponent upset because they know it's counterable, it is also usually usable to make them think, I'll wait here until you do it and then counter that move. Depending on your character, this means that you get to have them open themselves up or have defense for you. As you get higher level, this is harder. People like have trained against Sakurabot and automatically dash check and similar, but that's actually why our Sakurabot has that as its highest level goal. You have to learn to check Sakura's dashes because the rest of her playstyle will definitely put you in a situation where you're not going to do so just automatically.
You win.
Fortunately, until one is facing high-level Sakura, you're not generally worried too much about this because the other player isn't thinking about their perfect dash timings either, and if you hit enough buttons, if your own character has a good range, most likely you'll get through anyway.
It's go time.
And we continue to swirl back around even more. We're getting closer to the end of our stream. Hopefully that's not a sign of people being too tired and not playing because they didn't expect it to be their turn yet, but either way, the lounge is likely to stay open at least a bit longer, meaning that if you would like to join it now, you are searching for Rune Siren. This is more or less a US East Coast lounge. If you are under self-quarantine, as nearly all of the world is right now, I think it's the world. And you are a person who plays this game, you may be in range. That said, we do have the connection restriction set to 4 to 5, which means you may not be able to join even if you wanted to, depending on where you are. Sorry about that, but we're still waiting for a little final tweak to the netcode that they might get around to making. Nothing announced, just something we expect to be done. But Sakura versus Seth, Sakura basically doesn't get to throw projectiles ever.
Fight.
Does she win in footsies? Technically yes, but the way she wins in footsies is really complicated. If you are not too familiar with this style of play, it would get very confusing. You cannot walk up to Seth, you can only jump into footsie range, by most standards. That is relatively easy to do, because on any character who has really good long lunging attacks, you get the situation where the jump into footsie range also beats their advancing attack. If they thought you were coming forward, it works out well. So you take a couple steps forward and then you jump, but you make sure that the jump itself wouldn't have worked that way anyway. You wouldn't have been jumping for the sake of getting there. Your opponent then does something, and your goal at that point, react. That's basically it. Once you've gotten quote-unquote lucky at least once with this, then you can play all your pressure, you can figure out what to do. You can often get good situations based on just understanding frame data. And Sakura has good enough frame data to get through a lot of it. But understanding that you don't really get to walk up to Seth is important, because if you try to do it, you find yourself faced with stuff like that. And most Seth players, I would say, can do that fairly consistently. You don't have to throw the projectile either. He can just do the move, the spin kick, a lot of the time, and will just win out having done so. So if you find yourself at this range, sure, let the space open up so that you can then jump to take advantage of it. And if the next stage happens, the worst thing that happens is something that we often find ourselves facing as players of a game when we are told, this is how you do a thing. Our opponent does something to make the thing stop working, to make it an obviously bad idea. And many of us think, why did you tell me to do that? It's not working. It is still working. It's working because the reason you did it was to prevent them from doing a specific thing. In this case, Sakura walks back and jumps into Seth's range so that she doesn't have to keep chasing Seth on the ground. But if Seth is walking toward you because Seth expects you to do this, then you don't have to chase Seth anyway. You've already achieved what you wanted. It is this mindset change sort of thing that we specifically focus our Zeku bot on, for example. Understand how and when your opponent's change in flow is technically what you wanted to happen. It lets you think less, it lets you play the way the game you're used to playing, rather than having to worry about everything else that's going on. Meaning, you should think of it more as a way to get where you want than a winning strategy in itself. I wonder if that was mistranslated or if it's supposed to be short. Oh well. So for example here we have Seth playing footsies. Seth is walking forward, attempting to play footsies with Sakura, and now she would almost get to throw fireballs. It wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to throw fireballs, but Heavy Punch is a good option, because Heavy Punch for Sakura is almost always a good option. Stand Medium Kick can be one, depending on the scenario. And of course, depending on other skill with movement, you get to do some other things. Particularly, building up your V meter to V skill level, sorry, to V trigger level, makes this highly advantaged toward her. So activating V trigger now is almost the obvious option. Seth doesn't get to do that much. It's hard to whiff punish that move, it's hard to get through Sakura using it, and when she chooses to not use it, you're no longer thinking about that because you have to deal with it for so long. As players get better and better, this goes away, obviously. But then you get other options. So both sides just keep on improving in whatever way is needed, but the core stays the same. There doesn't generally come a point where Sakura has unlocked the ability to throw a ton of fireballs in this matchup. But it does help to occasionally throw them. Not so much because you expect them to work, but simply to keep your opponent thinking, oh wait, I might still need to keep that reaction in my head, that whole dealing with the fireball through the kick. Can't forget how to do that either. The higher you in level you get, the more people will be able to do other things easily without having to think about it, and the less effective overall throwing the projectile will be. But if you want to like challenge a high level player in pools at a tournament or something, this is a good way to aim for it, because at least you wouldn't become simplistic. They're probably going to beat you, but they will probably have more fun. And technically you should too. And And there's that trade that happens when the Sakura punches that move. It's not the greatest of trades, but it's better than having to deal with it at long range for no reason.
You lose.
This is another timing sort of thing. It's difficult to do directly because of the requirements of timing from Sakura's side. Seth tends to get to just do more moves, but Seth has always been that sort of character. There's still going to be some work done probably on figuring out exactly how to improve that, which buttons to use, etc. And of course, similar to Alex, there's a lot of timing involved from Sakura's side because she has to hit crouch heavy punch, I think. Crouch medium punch matters in a specific spacing. All of these little max range or with punishy perfect things come up. And Sethbot is most likely where that knowledge is going to come from, to be able to just do all of this training without having to specifically fight a Seth who is trying to outsmart you. Bots are meant to help you with the confidence of understanding and saying, this move actually works and I know how and when it works because I've hit it against the bot 200 times and I got my whole statistical distribution of if this move works or not.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
Nakali's strongest options in this matchup are basically his stand medium punch and the Seismo itself. Seth doesn't have a lot of ways to get past the Seismo move, because Seth has to move across the ground to do most things. Of course, targeting Seth actually moving in can lead to Seth walking right over the move, but you just do one closer that will be in front of Seth at the time. And the stand medium punch is all you really need beyond that. This is because the mental state that Seth players will end up getting into is one that is trying to approach Nakali while this is going on. Entirely possible, but much harder. This, however, is unhelpful because Seth just goes through projectiles.
Final round.
And has lots of ways around and over them as well. Technically, meaning that similar to Alex, the better use of V-meter in this matchup at this level is just to keep Seth off you. Because dealing with Seth pressure at close range on Nakali is not that easy really. You can uppercut out of it obviously, but Seth is also a character who's often going to bait you at least a little bit. And if you happen to get baited at the point where Seth has enough resources to do a ton of damage, well, most of the time, Seth will do a ton of damage. You're not using a move that is somehow hard to deal with, as just demonstrated. Worse yet, most of Seth's moves work in such a way that even if you mess up the actual combo, even the crush counter combo, Seth is still at advantage.
Seth wins. Round 1. Fight!
Stomp can also help, but mostly once Seth has blocked a move. Therefore, it's fairly easy to see this one play out.
Round 2. Fight!
Until you've practiced quite a lot relative to mindset things, it's difficult to stop yourself from doing certain aspects of your style when faced with a character who requires that you not do it. To the point where the sheets that we use to make notes on characters, we often keep track of things in terms of, this is the levels of the matchup. You need to do this thing first in order to unlock this thing, and so on. We have levels for literally withhold your own instinct to do X. This is often so important that it tends to be the first level in the matchup. Overall, you're literally telling yourself, no matter what you do, unless you know it's the absolute correct time, don't hit this button. It will result in bad things. In some way, don't hit it. Still enough health barely. But this guidance is punishable, and it doesn't become less punishable when Seth does it.
Final round.
Still, this is exactly the situation we refer to generally. Seth has a ton of resources, and Nikali has less, including screen space. This is going to make the V reversal even more important in the matchup at this point, simply because getting this kind of advantage doesn't necessarily mean that your goal should be, oh, I'm going to now deal with the situation. You can see how quickly that converts back. It makes the opponent think differently on their pressure, and that can be just enough time for your own instincts, if they are, for example, to uppercut, to win out. Whereas if you simply blocked the entire time and eventually uppercut when you were confident in it, your opponent might choose that exact moment to go, okay, they've been blocking a while, they probably want to uppercut, maybe I was making it stressful. This part of my pressure string isn't stressful, so I'm just gonna stop and block and see if they uppercut. V-reversal keeps that constant interaction in their mind. Something keeps on happening, and it is not them getting to hit buttons.
Round 1. Fight!
Now that they are back to normal, it's not going to be as seeming quickly necessary, but it is still going to come into play at least at some points. Still, the player's choice of when it's going to happen is important, and things like that are still technically beneficial. Basically, Nikali's response was to threaten the V-reversal enough that Seth decided, okay, I'm gonna go for this tip throw instead. But taking the throw is taking the throw. Sure, it becomes a problem when you eventually lose a lot of health because of it, but just changing your opponent's rhythm, mental state, by V-reversaling sometimes can be really helpful to you, even if it wasn't all that great a V-reversal. Sometimes even getting your V-reversal baited is meaningful because you still showed a specific mental state for yourself and made them think, oh, maybe they're thinking about V-reversaling me now and I should bait it more, other things. These things matter. Nakali's reversal isn't in itself a strong move, but rather the way that it causes most players to be spaced relative to Nakali's other options means he gets away with a lot after it a lot of the time. Even at high levels this is true. This is probably meant to be, at least partially, a trade-off for the fact that the character would really benefit lots more from using the V-trigger a lot of the time. But that's still, in the end, a matter of how you choose to win any given round. Because the other thing V-reversal often helps with against characters like Seth is making sure they don't build up so much meter that they can delete you. Characters who have good long block strings that force you to be under their control for long periods, it doesn't really necessarily show easily, but they definitely build up a lot more meter that way. But more importantly, this particular sequence that you've just seen is a different example of the same thing. It isn't that either player specifically got a whole ton more meter than the other, but rather that Seth can convert meter into damage faster than Nakali can if Seth is ahead. If Nakali is ahead, you don't care as much because you just have to confirm into super and Seth dies. But this moment is a problem. But with that spacing and no health left, the V-reversal is probably not going to be a big help, so let's go all in. But a perfect spacing reaction from the President, as mentioned before. If you saw one command grab, and this is your opponent, at least be ready for the next one. We are now, oddly, nearly 10 minutes over our usual stream ending time, which means this is it. That was the last match on stream for tonight, and there is probably Unist tomorrow. Probably. So join us for the Tuesday train. We'll check in to see what the stealth patch the game got was. And on Thursday we will have Dead or Alive. Friday content is as yet undecided, as is Wednesday. But for tonight, this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. You can find all our bots at 2-mk.org and all our stream announcements and bot release announcements at 2_mk_FGC. The lounge will stay open. Feel free to join us. Once again, 3 rounds, first to 2, characters let on. Good night, everyone.